Assalamu alaikum and welcome to our show, the Al-Islam and Community Issues Group. I'll be your host today, Brother Benjamin Shabazz, and we have a very special guest here, Dr. Ramsey Baroud. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you for having me.
Oh yes, it's our pleasure, believe me. We're going to open up the show with a small dua. Please join us if you like. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. With the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. We ask that you bless this show to reach as many people as possible and bless this show to have the best content to be effective for the best human behavior. Ameen.
Amen.
So glad you could make it.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'm really impressed by your world tour. But first of all, let's talk about who you are. You're Dr. Ramsey Baroud, right?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, so give us a little bit of background on your education.
Well, I was born and raised in a refugee camp in the Gaza Strip. My family originally comes from historic Palestine, which was taken over and destroyed in 1948, where the State of Israel currently exists. So my early educations were whatever education that was available for Palestinian refugees in refugee camps, mostly provided by UNRWA, which is a United Nations special institution created to cater for Palestinian refugees. And I've finished my high school in Gaza. Then I went to the West Bank, where I did 2 years at the University of Birzeit. But because of my political activism, I was deported by the Israeli occupation back to Gaza. Eventually found my way to the States, where I did my all of my degrees, really, my AA, my BA, and my MA, my last 2 degrees at the University of Washington. Then I went to Britain and I did my PhD at the University of Exeter. And now I do research at the University of California, Santa Barbara.
Outstanding.
Oh,
outstanding. I would love to get into more of that about how you went to school, in Palestine under those terrible situations. But first of all, you're doing a world tour, right?
Correct, yes.
And I see that you have a book here on, what's the name of this book?
This book is The Lost Earth, a Palestinian story. And it's the 4th book of mine. And it's it's a narrative nonfiction. And it's the story of Palestine as told from the viewpoint of Palestinian refugees being based in Palestine or in diaspora all over the world. And it's just, it's based on my PhD research. The idea behind it is based on my PhD research, which is, what we call people's history or history from below.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Can we get a close-up of the book, if it's possible? Okay, go ahead. You tell me history from below.
History from below, it's, if you reimagine historical events, but from the point of view of the oppressed, the downtrodden, the poor, you will always find that our understanding of history is almost entirely different from what we are often taught at school or at universities. So my research was really kind of an attempt to explore history from below, or people's history, and to rewrite the history of Palestine based on this understanding. So this is the 4th of the volumes really dedicated to this particular subject, and it has been so far the most successful.
Okay. So The Last Earth, a Palestinian story.
Correct.
By Ramsey Baroud. So how did you come up with that title?
Well, there is a famous poem by a Palestinian poet, Mahmoud Darwish, where he asks, where do we go after the last sky? This kind of sense of entrampment that Palestinians feel, the idea that the world is closing on us, and we have fewer and fewer options. So the last Earth is kind of a spin on that, on the last sky. Every refugee, ultimately, it tries to find a place where they could find peace, could find safety, shelter, and hope, ultimately hope. So the last Earth is a story of a number of refugees, each trying to find that piece of land, that last Earth, where they know that they can live, die, and be buried there. And unfortunately, they can't. That's really the point of the story, is that they can't. There's no last Earth, because that last Earth is your Palestinian homeland. And that Palestinian homeland is occupied, it's colonized by Israel. So there is this constant attempt, generation after generation, to find that piece of land, that last Earth, and somehow they still can't after 70 years.
I know I didn't ask you this before the show, but is there any particular passage you might want to read that you can just go to and read?
I had my notes with me, but I did not bring them. It would have been easier to read it on a
Okay.
but maybe later on I can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So this whole issue of Palestine is such a controversial issue, and it's. I think that as an African American, I can relate to the type of language that's being used.
Yeah.
You know, when something happens, the language is all twisted around, and it's your fault. It's your fault.
Yeah.
And that favorite statement, "What would you do?" What would you do if the and then Hamas is thrown out there like this is some big super organization, that has nuclear weapons and everything. So, as African Americans, we were under that same kind of propaganda.
Yeah.
I remember a civil rights, during the time of civil rights, there was a Caucasian lady who went down to the South, to help get people registered to vote. And they killed her, she got killed. And so, as soon as she got killed, the propaganda came out. She was fraternizing with Negroes. You see what I'm saying?
Yes, of course.
And so that supposedly made her life worthless. She got killed, so what? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So me personally, I'm very honored on the work that you do. And what I'd like to know is, what do you see in the future for the Palestinian state?
Right. Just before I answer that, I'd like to say that, as Palestinians, we kind of, we can relate to the struggles of all anti-colonial struggles throughout the years, and the struggle of our African American sisters and brothers in this country has always registered really in the collective psyche of the Palestinians. And this is not fake solidarity, it's just really, I grew up in a refugee camp knowing full well who Malcolm X was, who the Black Panthers were, what are the issues, what is the struggle, and how this is very much our struggle. And when you achieved something here, we felt it was our achievement as well. And the same thing goes to really all the honorable struggles for freedom, for human rights, for recognition, for identity throughout the South, and continues to be the case until this day. And one of my daughters, for example, is very much involved in the all sorts of anti-racist and campaigns at the university, and the Black Lives Matter movement. It's part and parcel of her political awareness, and there is nothing alien. It's not you do it because there's something exceptional about it. It's just part of our struggle as well. And I see the future of Palestine, really the future. To begin with, I think that the struggle for the Palestinians cannot be sectionalized or divided from the overall struggle that's happening all across the world right now for equality and for human rights, and with the landless societies in South America, or for equal rights and freedom of various minority groups and native struggle and African American struggle in this country. And this is what we call intersectionality, the idea that somehow we are all connected. And we are connected in the sense that when Palestinians are oppressed and colonized, and they continue to be oppressed and colonized, Israel will continue to set the kind of precedents that other military regimes around the world would follow. And this is why our struggle as oppressed is the same, and their struggle as oppressors is also the same. This is why you have this very strong affinity between the Trump regime and the government of right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu. It's just kind of a natural affinity because they know that more or less they are all involved in the same apparatus of oppression, whether in Palestine, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Yemen. It's all one and the same. And I think really the future of Palestine is going to be dependent on the resistance of the Palestinian people. As long as Palestinians resist, as long as their rights will always be preserved in the future. Our brothers and sisters in South Africa fought against apartheid for 50 years or so, but they also fought against colonialism for nearly 4 centuries. It's very important that we remember that prior to apartheid in South Africa, there was centuries of Dutch and British colonialism. And they survived and they fought and they fought, and eventually they obtained the freedom and the rights that they deserve. And I am not by any way belittling the challenges in the future. There is still a lot of work to be done in South Africa. But really the key to the freedom of and the end of apartheid in South Africa was the South African people and their struggle for their freedom and for their rights. And I think that is the same key for the success of the Palestinian collective struggle as well. That said, that cannot happen in isolation. The solidarity, international global solidarity with the Palestinian people must continue and must continue not just against Israel, but also against Israeli enablers who sadly come from this country, number one, but also other Western countries, Canada, the United Kingdom, and so forth. They have financed, they have created the Israeli project, they have financed it, they have sustained it, and they have prevented any attempt at reversing the horrific realities that were created by that regime over the last 70 years. We have to struggle against that. Our governments cannot continue to fund and finance Israel at the expense of oppressed, besieged Palestinians forever. So that's our responsibility as people outside of Palestine. You can't go and fight for the Palestinians in Gaza, I understand that. But there is no reason of why we can't play our part here in this country.
Very well put. I remember distinctly when Nelson Mandela had his funeral, the whole world attended. All the top officials attended. One person didn't attend.
Yeah.
Netanyahu.
Of course. Of course, yeah.
Now, he sent a representative, but he didn't come. So the question was asked, why didn't he attend? And he said it would be too expensive for security. I mean, that's just shameful. Yeah. That's just shameful.
But of course, we know that the reason he did not attend, because Nelson Mandela has been one of the strongest allies with the Palestinian people.
Exactly.
And his famous statement, "We will never be free until the Palestinians are free."
Exactly. Yeah, just to keep on that point, I remember Ted Koppel did an interview with him, and he asked him about the supporting Yasser Arafat and Fidel Castro. And there were a lot of Jews in the audience, and they were all like against what he had done. And he said, one of the biggest mistakes that news reporters do is they try to make you think that what they think you should think, And he said, how can I be a leader, if I abandon my way of thinking, for somebody else. He said, I will always support Fidel Castro and Yasser Arafat. He says, because they helped me with natural resources, not rhetoric, during our struggle.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, he made that point clear.
In my last trip to South Africa, I met with several fighters with the underground resistance of the anti-apartheid struggle. They were mostly stationed in Namibia at the time. And they told me of the kind of direct training and support that was coming from the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. Even their military uniform, their fighters' uniforms, were actually funded by the PLO, by Yasser Arafat. I'm very critical of Yasser Arafat for many things, but to be entirely honest, that was really kind of a moment where I felt proud that, that we had a kind of political consciousness, that we understand that this struggle that is seemingly far away from Palestine is very, very important for our struggle as well. He had that foresightedness to see it, and he was absolutely right. And I think the same thing can be reversed. People who think, well, the situation in Palestine is too alien and too far, why should I care? Well, here's an example of why we are very much all connected. Indeed, we are.
Yes, very much so connected. Let's talk a little bit about your world tour. Give us some of the places that you've been so far.
Well, every time I have a book, I go on a world tour. My book came out in February, and I almost immediately started. I started kind of locally in Washington State here, and then went to Canada, and then came back, and from there went to England and Scotland, and then I went to Austria, then I went to the Netherlands, and then I came back, and then I went to New Zealand, I went to Australia, and resting, because of Ramadan and all of that, but then heading back to South Africa, and there's another trip to Hawaii as well. And after that, the foreign editions of the book will come out, and then I will go to French-speaking countries, Spanish-speaking countries, Italian-speaking countries, and so forth. So I'm expecting that the tour is going to last for another year or so. And I'm using it really as kind of as an opportunity, not just to promote the book per se, but to promote the idea behind it. That, this kind of elitist thinking about problems and the elitist discourse, whether it's about Palestine or any other issue, it's never helpful. If you truly want to understand the essence of an issue, you have to understand it in a rounded sort of way. When it comes to history, you talk to the people who paid the heaviest price of it, of war, of class struggles, those who were oppressed by colonialism, by apartheid, by military occupation. You speak to the refugees, you don't speak to the politicians. Because the politicians, they have their talking points, they have their statements prepared most likely by someone else. They will never give you a true version of events, whether current events or past events. So my message is, let's try to understand Palestine beyond all the cliches that we hear in the news. This whole idea that a Palestinian is either a terrorist or a victim. We need to, walk away from it entirely and think of Palestine, Palestinian culture, Palestinian history, people, as is quite a dynamic and powerful narrative that has to be understood from the point of view of ordinary Palestinians. That's what my book is about. But it's written in such a way that it almost reads like a novel, in a sense. It's stories of everyday life, love and struggles, but within these stories, you understand the politics. It's always there. That kind of unite all of these narratives together. So it's very much readable, but at the same time, it really does give you a larger story that otherwise you would never experience watching the news or anything of that nature.
Okay, all right. What is the reaction that you've gotten from people who oppose this, your work, I should
Right.
say? What kind of problems have you had?
Right. Now that's really interesting is that because, of course, wherever you go, especially if I'm touring in Western countries, there's, more likely you are going to find a pushback. I have had various events canceled, various universities canceling on me, just because I'm a Palestinian. And I'm a Palestinian who opposes Israeli colonialism and Israeli apartheid. Not because of who I am, what I stand for, the type of writing, but just that mere idea. In Austria, I had 4 different events canceling on me until finally we found a place that didn't, because they were afraid that by hosting someone who opposes Israeli apartheid, and it could be perceived, could create controversy and problems for them, sadly. But the 2 things. Number one, I think the mood is changing a great deal on Palestine. I think it's Israel that is really on the defensive, as opposed to the Palestinians being on the defensive. When I came to the US about 24 years ago, I went to speak at Kane Hall at the University of Washington. And I just remember how tough it was. The audience was quite hostile. The university was not very happy, and there was a lot of kind of a tug of war until I managed to actually speak at the university. Now, most campuses are very welcoming of a Palestinian point of view. All the pressure that the Zionists and the Israelis put on universities to kind of reverse their agendas, because they know that they are losing control over campuses. And if you lose control and your influence over campuses, this is the generation that is going to define the future. That's a very good sign. And I see these kind of changes. So the other thing that I'd like to say is that when you present narrative that is not, it's not a blame game, one state versus 2 states, who's responsible. No, you present the stories that, the daily grind and the daily struggles of ordinary people. It's very tough for any sort of propaganda to try to negate that. So I had at a university in Canada, for example, the Zionists organized pretty well, and they came trying to demolish my ideas in advance, and I'm sure that they've done their research and watched many of my media interviews and all of this, and they came with all these prepared questions, but they were surprised that I wasn't really talking politics per se. I was talking about ordinary people. And when they stood and they started asking all these hostile questions, their narrative seemed completely out of place, like it didn't belong there. And I like that. I like the fact that we can actually successfully humanize the Palestinians, and by humanizing the Palestinians, you dehumanize the Zionist narrative at the same time. So this is the kind of history that I encourage people, not just Palestinians, but really people who feel that the issue of their people, their nations, their groups are not being told fairly and is mispresented and misconstrued in the media, is to explore the subject of people's history and to try to humanize, as opposed to fall into the trap of kind of contentious political ideologies, because then it ends up, to the general public, it sounds more like cliches than actual reality that they can relate to. If I tell you the story, for example, of a prisoner who's a woman and who went on a hunger strike for nearly 50 days, and she was being tortured by the Israelis during that hunger strike, and they wanted her to confess something that she did not do, and she's a refugee, and I tell you the story of her family and all of this. People can relate to that beyond Palestine, beyond religion, beyond anything. They can relate to her as a female, as a woman who is oppressed in a situation that is absolutely extraordinarily horrific. So anyone, whether from Seattle to Sydney to Johannesburg, can feel for that person. And it's very important that we liberate then her narrative out of the stifling political discourse and place it into a whole different form of storytelling. And I think it is so very important, really.
That's amazing. We need more of that. I'm looking at the clock. Naeem, is it possible for you to put up the name of this book, The Last Earth, A Palestinian Story? If not, we can probably do it at another time. But if you can put it on the screen. Yeah, you talked about the people's history. I remember we was talking about that, about Howard Zinn.
Yes.
You know, and maybe you could comment on that again, so we can refresh the memory of people who probably heard of that book but didn't pick it up.
Well, I became familiar with the book about really over 20 years ago. I was a student at the University of Washington, and I found this book called A People's History of the United States. And it's just like, people's history, what does that mean? Now, yes, I do come from Gaza, and history is often told through the people. But on the other hand, the formulation of the theory of history that way, for me, was kind of quite an alien subject. And then when I read it, and I saw that it's the story of the Native Americans, the stories told through the point of view of the slaves, through the working class, the people who paid a very, very heavy price for this country to be established, the entire groups of people who were wiped out in order for this country to claim the greatness that it claims today. It's just the idea, it hits me. Like, what if I write one day a people's history of Palestine? It sounded like a very distant and strange idea at the time. But with years and years of studies and research, I made it happen. And I can tell you more about what does it really entails in terms of what does it mean practically.
Okay. Well, we got the music there. That's telling us we got to wrap it up. So I want to shake your hand again and say thank you so much for coming on the show. And right now on the show, I'm going to pinpoint you. Would you be willing to do a part 2 at some future date?
Absolutely, with pleasure.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for our viewing audience. Thank you for watching, and assalamu alaikum.